Welcome, listeners, to Together with Feeding New York State. I'm Ryan Healy.
And I'm Melissa Herring-Yanman.
And today we're excited to be joined by Assemblymember Jessica Gonzalez-Rojas, who represents the 34th Assembly District in Queens. Assemblymember, welcome to the program.
Thank you both for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Before we get started, we just have a very controversial question we want to lead with. Which of the 5 boroughs in New York City has the best food?
Ooh, no doubt. Queens. Queens, we're the world's borough with the best food.
Absolutely. And me being from the Caribbean, I have to attest, there's some great Caribbean food in the Queens as well.
Yes, literally give me a country and I'll bring you to its food.
Perfect. Amazing. So starting with our first question here, can you tell us a little bit about your district and the prevalence of food insecurity there?
Yes, so I represent one of the most diverse districts, not just in the city or state, but I would argue the world. We have people from across the globe that live in the district, whether it's Ecuador or Colombia or Bangladesh or Tibet or Nepal or the Philippines. We are, again, reflective of the world's borough, again, with the best food. And however, this also means that many of our communities are struggling. We have a large working class immigrant population. We were the epicenter of the epicenter during the COVID-19 pandemic, or the height of it. And what we saw during that time was lines wrapped around food pantries with hungry families seeking to help make ends meet. So we know in New York State, 1 in 4 adults are experiencing food insecurity. And in my district alone, some of the data I have shows that, at least 15% of my constituents utilize programs like SNAP, and food insecurity is at much higher rates than it is across the country in my district.
That's helpful. Thanks, Assemblymember. And going back to the pandemic, obviously, in response to the pandemic, Congress stepped up and provided free school meals for all kids across the country. And as you know, last month, Governor Hochul proposed that New York State provide universal free school meals for all New York kids. And as an advocate, as someone who has been pushing for this issue for years, what is the significance of this announcement and what will this mean for New York families?
Oh my gosh, first I want to thank you all for being such a champion on this issue. For many years, for the last 3 budget cycles, myself and Senator Hinchey have been fighting for universal school meals. This means free breakfast and free lunch for every single child across the state, no matter their zip code, how much money is in the banks of their families. We want to ensure that we are able to address childhood hunger and poverty. And oftentimes, school is the only place where a child will get a meal. We know that a universal school meal program would mean $165 back in the pocket of families in grocery spending per child each month. So that could be, over 100, 1,600 a year, up to 2,000, and again, even more depending on how many children a family has. And I often say we cannot teach a hungry child, and it's so critical that we level the playing field and stop mean testing this issue and make sure that we both reduce stigma and improve the academics and the behavior of our students by making sure they have a meal. We do a lot of work with school social workers, and oftentimes they tell me when a child ends up in their office because of a behavioral issue, the first question they ask them is, have you had a meal yet? And oftentimes that answer is no. And, our teachers, our social workers, our principals have had a stockpile granola bars and other snacks to help feed our children across the state. And they shouldn't have to do that. So we're so thrilled that the governor included this in her budget for this year. It was a lot of years of advocacy, a lot of engagement of groups like yours, like food justice groups, union leaders, the teachers union, parent leaders, school leaders. It's been wonderful to work across a diverse spectrum of advocates. It's a bipartisan bill. So we're thrilled to see it finally come to fruition and can't wait to see the bill signed.
Absolutely, Assembly Member, and really thank you for all that you've done to get this in the works with Universal School Meals as well. It's such an amazing program, and we also know that it's one of many great initiatives that help to fight food insecurity in our state. And so, looping back to the executive budget, another proposal that wasn't included was to guarantee a $100 minimum SNAP benefit for all New Yorkers. This initiative is also one that's drawn strong bipartisan support in the legislature, cross-ideological support from New York voters, and endorsements from over 250 anti-hunger, anti-poverty, and industry groups. So how do we translate this popular support into a state commitment in the upcoming budget?
Well, we're doing everything to continue to push. We did a lot of work last year and got a lot of support. Myself and Senator Rachel May, who carries the bill with me, went food shopping with you also, Ryan, to show what does $23 a month mean. That is the minimum benefit for someone on SNAP per month. And at that time, which was probably May or June, we were able to get milk, eggs, cereal, and blueberries, and that's it. That couldn't even feed anyone breakfast for the entire month, forget about 3 meals. And with rising inflation and these potential tariffs that the President Trump is proposing, we're hearing that eggs could be $11 themselves, which would cover basically half the minimum benefit. New Jersey passed this and they're at $95 a month. So we're really pushing, we're circulating letters to have this proposal included in the budget to increase the SNAP minimum benefit from $23 a month to $100 a month. And we know that this would help so many people and would benefit on average older adults that only earn around $16,000 per year. So this actually disproportionately impacts older adults on a fixed income, and we know how helpful this would be in terms of feeding our community in a time where there's rising costs of groceries and all sorts of expenses, housing, etc. So we're hopeful that this will be included in the budget. We're certainly going to fight. The budget is not supposed to be passed till April 1st. So we will continue to advocate until the last moments to get this included.
Right. Well, thanks, Assembly Member, and thank you and Senator May and the advocates in the legislature for really pushing this effort. Because at the end of the day, right, it's about dignity for folks who participate in SNAP.
Exactly.
Less than $1 a day just doesn't get you anywhere.
And nope, not in this economy.
Nope. Another issue of dignity is around SNAP access. And so another issue that you've advocated for is to create some form of a state-funded SNAP program for New Yorkers excluded on the basis of their immigration status. And as you know, back in December, New York's Child Poverty Reduction Advisory Council included a recommendation of a state-funded food assistance program for non-citizen households with children. So looking ahead, how do we build off this momentum and pass some form of a SNAP for All program while also ensuring that New Yorkers are protected given the threats and actions coming from the federal government?
Yeah, we know 800,000 children in New York State are living in poverty, and that is like one in five. This is the fourth highest in the nation. We have to make sure that we're not discriminating against families due to their immigration status. There's often families with mixed status, and we need to make sure that we're including every child, every family member that would be eligible for SNAP otherwise, but due to their immigration status are excluded. So again, this was included in those recommendations. And we're, again, really grateful to have the support of so many advocacy organizations. And we really have to tackle hunger in this state with bold solutions, and that means SNAP for All. So this is another advocacy point for this year. We're continuing to press and push on this issue, and we want to make sure SNAP is a program. We know how effective it is, and in fact, it's a good program for our economy. Right. Every dollar invested in SNAP generates up to $1.80 in local economic benefits, right? We know people who have that card, that EBT card, as spending it back in the community. And SNAP accounts for about 10% of grocery industry sales. So it is good for the economy, and is, of course, good for families when everyone's included who is eligible.
Right.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Assemblymember, and really appreciate you chatting through all of these initiatives that we can do to strengthen the SNAP program. So I'm curious to know if there are any other issues, included or not, in the executive budget that you'd like to uplift at this point.
There's a number of issues that are not included that I'd love to lift up. I think particularly around SNAP, we're seeing a crisis of skimming that's happening across the nation, quite honestly. And basically, the EBT cards are not secure. They don't have that chip that many of our own, like, credit cards have, that provide additional layers of security. I have a number of bills that seek to address and remedy that issue. One that would ensure that we use the EMV chip, which is that stronger security chip in our EBT cards. Because what's been happening is that people have been, filling their grocery carts, getting to the checkout counter, swiping their cards because it has a swipe, the strip, and finding zero money in their account. And when they look online, it's been stolen by someone in California or Chicago or someplace else in the country. And up until December 20th of last year, they were able to file for reimbursement of those costs that were stolen. But as of December 20th, 2024, the federal government is no longer reimbursing those families. So that is really tragic for, targeting the most vulnerable. At no fault of their own are they seeing their SNAP funds being stolen from them. So I have a bill that would upgrade the card, and that I have a bill that would also amend social service law to allow the state to reimburse, because right now it's a federal program where we know we can't rely on the federal government right now on this issue. So it's really incumbent upon the state to do more. And some of my colleagues in the legislature have been really great advocates, including Khalil Anderson and Marcela Mantenas, who have bills also to help, create a fund and supplement that money so we can reimburse families that have been victim of skimming.
Yeah, thank you for raising that issue, and also for you and your colleagues' work in the legislature, everything from card security to allowing the state to reimburse. It should also
Exactly.
be noted for some of our listeners, New York State is by far was the hardest hit on the issue of SNAP skimming. The issue has continued to affect families around the state. So this is a crisis so thanks for taking the lead on that.
Yes. And again, it actually upgrading the card, it would just be, I think, 4 to 7 million. And by law, we believe that the federal government would have to cover half. Again, we're in a very precarious situation with our federal government, but we would anticipate that would be half covered by the federal government. So it's actually a very, very small cost of what the state budget would be, which is anticipated to be $250 billion. A couple million is a teeny fraction to actually get to the root cause of a vulnerable card system that leaves, folks who rely on SNAP for their food victims to this type of skimming. We just really need to address it at its core.
Right, absolutely. So moving a little bit beyond food and nutrition policy. So you've also introduced some critically important legislation to phase out sub-minimum wages for tipped workers. Could you just set the stage for our listeners why New York State needs to join states around the nation in getting rid of sub-minimum wages and moving to one fair wage?
Oh, yes. So I don't know that most people know this, but restaurant workers, incarcerated people, and people with disabilities are the only individuals that earn a sub-minimum wage. And right now in New York City, the minimum wage for all industries, except for those industries I just mentioned, earn $16.50 as a minimum wage. Restaurant workers, the servers in particular, earn $11 an hour. That is such a problem. The expectation is that they earn the state's minimum wage with tipping, But, restaurants have a wide spectrum of customers, and places like your diners and your Denny's and your casual restaurants, you may not see, the highest tippers. And we know that the industry has, is a lot of women of color that are depending on tips to pay their rent, and they shouldn't. They should have a one fair wage, right? So the bill would move the sub-minimum wage towards the minimum wage, the state's minimum wage, over the course of 3 to 4 years, depending on New York City or outside of New York City metropolitan area. So it would phase it in over the period of 3 or 4 years to ensure that restaurant workers end up making at least minimum wage with tips on top. And I want to underscore, with tips on top. We're
Right.
not eliminating tipping. It is still a vital need, but it should just be gratuitous, and people shouldn't have to depend on the generosity of their customers to put food on their own table, to pay their rent, to clothe their children. So it's really important to get this bill passed in order to ensure equity amongst the restaurant workers with all other workers in the state of New York. And we have, again, a lot of support. We've been fighting for this for years. Unfortunately, we're up against a very strong restaurant lobby that is actually circulating misinformation. They're saying tips will go away, which is not true. I think 7 other states have passed these laws. They've eliminated the sub-minimum wage. Those workers are on a minimum wage, and tipping has not gone down. And in fact, business has been thriving in many of those states. So it's good for workers. It'll actually be good for the restaurant industry to move away from a two-tiered system. And again, would allow restaurant workers to ensure that they have a consistent living wage that they're bringing home, plus the gratuitous tips on top. That, is wonderful, and they're very deserving of that, but they shouldn't have to wholly depend on that in order to make ends meet.
Absolutely, Assemblymember. Again, really appreciate you pushing for this important issue, making sure that people have a fair wage.
Exactly. It's justice and dignity for all workers, and that's what we're fighting for.
Exactly. You phrased it so perfectly. Justice and dignity for all workers and for all New Yorkers.
Yes, and I actually want to make a point, and this connects back to our conversation on SNAP. The research that was done, I think, at the University of California, looking at the states that have a minimum wage versus those that have the sub-minimum wage, we see that many restaurant workers are utilizing government benefits to survive: housing assistance, food assistance, cash assistance, etc. And in New York State, nearly 18% of restaurant workers depend on SNAP. So again, when we're talking about food, the people who are literally serving you food in the restaurants cannot afford to put food on their own tables. And that's a huge injustice.
Absolutely. And I really think you're hitting at the intersectionality of all of these issues, whether
Exactly.
food insecurity or, like you mentioned, housing really briefly too.
Exactly.
And so one last issue that we know you've led on is the Coverage for All campaign. For our listeners, what is this initiative looking to do?
So Coverage for All would allow us to leverage federal dollars to allow for undocumented immigrants to enroll in the New York State Essential Plan. The New York State Essential Plan is the health plan that was established under the Affordable Care Act. We get through a complicated mechanism, but we get there's a surplus money that we get from the federal government that has been basically sitting and growing and must be used for innovative programs to expand the Essential Plan. And for years, we've been fighting to leverage those dollars to allow for undocumented immigrants to be covered. And again, this is health insurance coverage, meaning that they will no longer have to rely on emergency Medicaid, which is basically the only health insurance undocumented people can rely on to get care, which is far more expensive than being able to enroll in one of the essential healthcare programs. Now, unfortunately, with the election of Trump, we don't anticipate the federal waiver being approved. It would require a waiver to the federal government to say that we can use these dollars for these purposes. Other states have done it, Colorado and Washington State. And everything is very precarious and terrifying right now. So sadly, we don't anticipate this moving in the next 4 years, perhaps. But again, my fight is to find ways to ensure that every person has access to, the healthcare they need, the food that they need to survive, the housing assistance. When we provide those basic necessities to live, then everyone gets to thrive. We will see less homelessness, we'll see less hunger, we'll see less poverty, we'll see less, health epidemics. It's really important that there's equitable access to the basic needs for every single New Yorker. Again, we're not hopeful that coverage for all is going to move given the federal government, and it was very dependent on the federal government, but we're certainly unwavering in our commitment to fight for health justice for everyone.
Right. And so even though coverage for all is, not looking promising in the years ahead, I hope for our listeners that, you're piecing together the connection really between our healthcare system, where we do not guarantee healthcare coverage for all as a human right, to the fact that we have a broken housing system and a housing crisis, to the fact that many New Yorkers, millions of New Yorkers each day are struggling to afford food. All of these systems, which are really basic human rights, healthcare, housing, living wages, et cetera. These are all important, I think, for our listeners to recognize as determinants of food security as well. So in that context, Assembly member, what's a call to action that you have for our listeners?
Look up your assembly member and your senator in the state level. You can go to nyassembly.gov and nysenate.gov and put in your address. Reach out to them, talk about how these initiatives are important. Your support for universal school meals, your support for SNAP for all, the $100 minimum benefit, addressing skimming, ensuring health coverage for all New Yorkers. It's really important that you raise your voice and be heard. Talk to your families and communities about this. The election taught us that people care about making ends meet and the basic necessities of being able to survive and thrive in this state and other states across the country. And these are the actual solutions to addressing that. And we need to make sure that everyone's voices are heard in advocating for these important policies.
That's exactly right. Thank you, Assembly member. You heard it, listeners. Assemblymember Jessica Gonzalez-Rojas, representing New York's 34th Assembly District. Thank you so much for joining us today. And remember, listeners, together we can end hunger and poverty in New York State. Thank you.
Thank you.